Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Today we're going to be talking about women reform and movements. So women had many duties at home and in the community. However, they had very few legal or political rights. Abigail Adams, the wife of second President John Adams, was a strong proponent for women's rights, telling her husband to remember the ladies during the Constitutional Convention. Women's cries for equality went mostly unheard. Many women in the early 1800s were influenced by the abolition movement in the North. Women would be actively engaged in fighting for the rights of African Americans and were leaving their wants and needs on the back burner. Many abolitionist women who struggled to gain equal rights for themselves began to fight for their own rights. They quickly found that they needed to defend their right to speak in public and to make their voices heard. Women made strides spearheading reform movements against prisons, alcohol, prostitution, and slavery. Unfortunately, many critics did not want women to leave their traditional female roles as homemakers. There were a number of well-known women reformers in the early 19th century. Two influential women that advocated for equal rights for women and the abolition of slavery were sisters Angelina and Sarah Grimke. The Grimke sisters came from a slave-holding family in South Carolina, and their fight to participate in the freeing and educating of enslaved African Americans eventually led to their involvement for the fight for women's rights. Angelina contested traditional norms when she refused to obey her husband during their marriage ceremony. In 1836, Angelina published a pamphlet named An Appeal to the Christian Women of the South, and Sarah published one named The Epistle to the Clergy of the Southern States, in which both pamphlets argued against slavery. Another well-known women's rights activist was Sojourner Truth. In 1797, Truth was born Isabella Baumfree, a slave in New York. In 1826, a year before New York abolished slavery, she escaped from her slave owner to an abolitionist family and began to work for the church. In 1843, she declared that the Spirit called on her to be a traveler and to preach the truth, renaming herself Sojourner Truth. Even though Sojourner Truth never learned to read or write, she impressed many people with her speeches advocating for the abolition of enslaved people and women's rights. Other women reformers included transcendentalist Margaret Fuller, who in 1845 wrote Women in the 19th Century, which stressed the individualism of people, especially to women. Lucy Stone was a gifted speaker who is well known for her abolitionist speeches for the Anti-Slavery Society and who triggered the Nation on Women's Rights. Susan B. Anthony, who turned the fight for women's rights into a political movement and argued for things like equal pay for equal work, saying things like no woman can be free without a purse on her own. Finally, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who founded and led the National Women's Suffrage Association and wrote many documents and speeches about women's rights movement. Even though women were leading the fight for their rights, men would also join the fight. However, women's concerns became a national issue when women took more of an active leading role in reform and abolition. The fight for women's rights did not always travel the easy path. In fact, it hardly ever did. There was a women's right opposition movement forming at the same time that women were advocating for their rights, and it came from both the sexes. Men would oppose the women's rights movement, saying things like women lack the physical or mental strength to survive without men's protection, and even some women opposed the movement, arguing that they did not need any new rights. So abolitionists and women believed in their movement and that they needed a meeting where the most powerful advocates could unite and discuss the future plans of reform in the United States. Reformers Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucetta Mott, an educated Bostonian, a powerful advocate for reform, who was a bridge between the feminist and the abolitionist movement, brainstormed an idea that would organize prevalent speakers into one area and invite other reformers to attend. On July 19, 1848, in Seneca Falls, New York, the Seneca Falls Convention convened. The Seneca Falls Convention launched the first organized women's rights movement in the United States and was the first public meeting about women's rights held in the United States. It was attended by some 240 people, including men like Frederick Douglass and many other reformers who worked in the temperance and abolitionist movements. Susan B. Anthony fought for women's suffrage or the right to vote and equal pay for equal work. Men and women alike argued for things like women's equality, improved laws regarding child custody, divorce, and property rights. The founding fathers of our nation fought against the tyranny of the British Crown and demanded their freedom when Thomas Jefferson penned the Declaration of Independence, where he claimed that all men are created equal. The obvious fallacy of Jefferson's words were that all men excluded Native American, enslaved people, and women. In 1837, Sarah Gremke wrote men and women were created equal. Whatever is right for men to do is right for women. These words were mirrored in a document that was written at the convention. The organizers of the convention wrote a document that detailed the beliefs about social injustice towards women that they called the Declaration of Sentiments or the Declaration of Rights. They used the Declaration of Independence as the basis for its language. However, the authors of the document included 18 charges against men. The declaration was signed by over 100 of the convention's attendees. Women's rights gained momentum during the 19th century, but it didn't last long as the nation soon became distracted by the sectional tension of slavery and the nation would plunge into civil war. Women's struggles would continue for generations to come. So you could see that there are a lot of women's rights movements going on in the United States on urbanization. We've covered temperance. We've covered now they're pushing for abolition. They're pushing for their own rights, the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. So women's rights are on the move during this time in American history. Urbanization, industrialization, and reform. I'll see you next time.